the hypothalamus, isn't a very big brain area, but it's an important one. And it's sufficiently sophisticated so that if you take a female cat, and there's an important reason that it's female, and you take out basically its whole brain, the limbic system that's responsible for emotions, and the whole cortical cap, so it basically has no brain except for a spinal cord and a hypothalamus. And if you keep it in a relatively closed environment, you know, like a cage, it pretty much acts like a normal cat. It can do all the normal cat things. It can engage in defensive aggression. It can eat. It can drink. It can sleep. It's conscious, you know, insofar as you can tell whether or not an animal is conscious. It's hyper-exploratory, which is extraordinarily peculiar because the last thing you'd expect of a cat with no brain would be to be hyper-exploratory, right? It seems to be insanely curious about everything. And that's what that seems to indicate, is that its psychomotor exploratory system, which is in fact grounded in the hypothalamus, is still active, but it can't build up the memory representations that would inhibit the exploratory activity, because basically what you're doing when you explore is you're taking something complex and then you're mapping its responses in relationship to the transformations of your body, and insofar as the set of transformations of your body that you're likely to manifest, say in this place, have zero motivational relevance, which is really what you're hoping for most of the time, then you build up a representation of the place that's part of that perceptual motor hierarchy, and it shuts off your curiosity about it. And then what you perceive from then on in really is your representation of the thing rather than the thing itself. And you're kind of happy about that because it's easier to see what you've already learned than it is to see the thing itself. Now, things can get re-novelized. You know, if someone acts very peculiarly right beside you, you're like the whole space around you is going to get re-novelized very rapidly, and your body will go on alert because of that. But basically what you're doing is learning in order to ignore, right? Because you want to pay attention to everything all the time? It's like, that's a short path to exhaustion. Because if everything's relevant, then your body goes on hyper alert, and you produce cortisol, and you know, you're ready for anything, and that's kind of exciting, but as a long-term survival strategy, it's a bad one. You just don't have the energy to maintain that for any length of time. So part of the reason the cat is hyper-exploratory is because the systems that mediate exploration are still intact as long as it has a hypothalamus and some of the rough underlying circuitry that associates that with the motor output system. But it can't remember what it's explored, so it just stays hyper-exploratory. It's also hyper-reactive, say, to cues of aggression. I would say like a hypothalamic cat is a lot like a 2-year-old. You know, and I mean that in the best possible way. 2-year-olds are extremely curious, they're hyper-exploratory, they're very, very reactive to stimuli, you know, they cry easily, they laugh easily, they run around easily, they get scared easily, they, you know, experience pain easily. So, and it isn't until they build the higher order structures in the you know, perceptual motor hierarchy that all gets integrated and they're not so reactive. Then they're nowhere near as much fun at that point either, you know. But, you know, and so the female cat can regulate its water intake, and it can also engage in sexual activity. Now, a male cat can't do that. It needs more brain than just the hypothalamus because it's more complicated to sequence male sexual behavior. So you can tell the difference between a male cat with no cortex, let's say, no limbic system, and a female cat, but pretty much only in that particularity. So you know, so that's very interesting, eh? Because if you study neuropsychology and you're taught by clinical neuropsychologists, say, or even neuropsychologists that have a clinical background, they're very corticocentric. You know, and I think it's partly a hangover. We're you know, since we got unseated from our position at the center of the universe, we've been, you know, radically running around trying to figure out what it is that makes us special in relationship to animals, and we've kind of cottoned on to the idea that, you know, we have this big cortical cap, and especially the prefrontal cortex, and it's very large in relationship to our body, which it is, and that, you know, somehow that distinguishes us from other animals, which it does, but that's also led us into thinking that the most recently evolved parts of the brain are the most important. It's like, and in some sense the smartest, you know, but there's a real error of presumption there, because you might think instead that it's those parts of the brain that evolution has had the longest time to work on that are in fact the smartest, and they do take care of all the heavy lifting. Your consciousness isn't entrusted with any of the heavy lifting. You can fiddle around the edges with it, but you're not going to be allowed to do anything that's really, that's really physiologically profound, and it's a good thing, because you just don't have the intellectual capacity to manage that kind of ongoing physiological monitoring. It's like, you don't understand your body. If you're lucky, the thing works and you can ignore it, roughly speaking, but if it ever goes wrong, good luck trying to figure it out consciously. We're getting somewhere with that, but it's very, very difficult to do. So